In this video, I'm going to show you how to take your dingy Game Boy Color from looking like this to this. No shell trimming is needed as long as you purchase an IPS-ready shell, and soldering is completely optional. So in essence, this kit can quite literally be considered a plug and play. I'll have all of the links to everything you need in the description of this video, and all you need is a working Game Boy Color. To get started, you of course need to disassemble your Game Boy Color. I will walk through the steps to do so, but you can skip ahead if you don't need this part. So let's go ahead and remove the battery cover and take out these AA batteries here so that we can access all of the screws on this Game Boy. You're going to need two different screwdrivers here. One is a tri-wing screwdriver and another one is a Phillips head. There's 6 screws total to remove the back of this shell. 2 inside of the battery compartment, 2 midway up the shell, and then 2 at the very top of the shell. So now we can go ahead and lift off the back part of the shell. And before anybody asks, yes, this is a different Game Boy. So there are 3 Phillips head screws, so you need the Phillips head screwdriver to unscrew the remaining 3 on the board. And now the last step to detach your Game Boy motherboard from the rest of the shell is to remove the motherboard from the screen. And in order to do so, there are 2 bails on either side that are locking the ribbon cable into place. Just slip those up and remove carefully the ribbon cable out of the top of the motherboard. Since we're using a pre-trimmed IPS-ready shell, we don't need to do anything else with this shell. All we needed was the motherboard. So let's go ahead and get this thing cleaned off with some 99% IPA. Anything 70% or higher should be fine. But the big thing here is to remove the 20 plus years of dirt and grime that's inside of the motherboard while it's out in the open. So now that we have the motherboard extracted, it's time to do a dry test on the kit just to make sure everything's functional, there's no dead pixels or anything else before we complete the full installation of the kit. No need to be intimidated by these wires though. Remember, soldering is completely optional, and I will show you what to do with these wires later on in this video. So what I'm doing right now, and it's not necessarily needed yet because the components won't be touching during the dry run, but I'm going ahead and pasting the insulation films on the back of the LCD screen and the PCB driver board. And what this does is when it's fully installed, it just helps to prevent any shorts with components touching. So now let's go ahead and get a hold of the motherboard and grab the PCB driver board, and I'm going to insert it in the connector on the top of the motherboard, and I'm going to press the 2 bails on either side to lock the ribbon cable into place. Next, I'm going to connect the LCD to the PCB driver board. This can be a little bit tricky. You're going to want to align the connector from the LCD to the connector on the driver board and apply just a little bit of pressure to get it to lock into place. If you feel like you're pushing too hard and nothing's going in, then you are not aligned and you better stop before you break something. It should snap into place pretty easily once everything is actually aligned. So once it's snapped into place, it is time to do a dry test. You can use alligator clips or the back of a Game Boy Color shell if you don't have any, and slap in 2 AA batteries and flip the power switch to turn the Game Boy on to check and see that everything is working properly before we install. And everything is looking absolutely splendid here, so it is time to go ahead and confidently install this backlight modification kit the rest of the way. So we're going to go ahead and set the LCD screen into the shell by going ahead and peeling off the paper around the adhesive. And one thing that's really awesome about the laminated screen is, one, it's a really awesome viewing experience with no gap in between the lens and the screen. But also, you don't have to worry about any misalignment or dust getting stuck between the lens, which could be a massive headache for other kits that do not have a laminated screen. So once the adhesive is peeled off, go ahead and slide it into place. It should fall into place pretty easily, and then I'm pressing around the edges just to make sure that the adhesive is pressed against the shell. This next step is soldering the wires, which again is completely optional. And all it does is allows you button controls to press select A and B to toggle the OSD menu. But you have all of the brightness controls, pixel modes, and color modes on the touch sensors at the top of the shell. So again, this step is only needed if you want the button controls. And there is one extra feature with the button controls that the touch sensors don't have, but I'll explain that in a minute. So on the driver board, you can see written out select A and B, and what you want to do is go ahead and solder the wires to those pads. I'm going to go ahead and tin them by applying some flux and a little bit of solder just to make it easier to attach the wires to the board. Now be really careful around this. I would actually recommend removing that ribbon connector because I'm soldering so close to it, but in this video I was a little bit too lazy and luckily didn't damage it. And it's always good practice to go ahead and clean off any of that remaining flux residue with some IPA. And now it's time to go ahead and grab the motherboard, and we're going to solder these wires to the test points above the A, B, and select buttons. You could alternatively solder the wires to some vias on the top part of the motherboard if you want to hide them better, but I think soldering them to the test points are a little bit easier. And I'm getting some wire cutters to trim the wires since they definitely don't need to be as long as they currently are. But I'm also making sure there's still a little bit of wiggle room. And since I trimmed the wires, I'm also going to strip them so that some of the wire is exposed from the coating. And for some preventative measures, I'm going to put some Kapton tape over the button contacts to ensure that I don't accidentally get solder on the pads. And like before, I'm going to go ahead and tin the pads with some flux and solder to make the process very easy. And once everything is ready, I'm going to go ahead and grab some tweezers and solder the wires from the corresponding button label from the driver board. And then once all of the wires are soldered into place, I'm going to use some more Kapton tape to route the wires such that they won't get pinched, making sure to avoid any possible screw holes or covering any of the button contacts. And now that that's done, all you really have to do is just put the Game Boy back together. So I'm locking in the driver board to the motherboard one last time, making sure that the two bells on either side are fully locked in. So I'm going to place all the buttons and membranes where they're supposed to go, and then attaching the PCB to the LCD screen very carefully. Like I said before, it should snap into place pretty easily. If it doesn't, then it's just not aligned. So let's go ahead and screw the motherboard into the front of the shell using the 3 Phillips head screws, and then go ahead and peel off the paper from the touch sensors and apply them to both corners of the top of the shell. Make sure the wires are tucked away. Don't forget the infrared sensor and the power switch, and then go ahead and screw in the 6 tri-wing screws to the back of the shell. I'm also going to place this sticker on the back of the shell as a final touch. And now I'm going to show you how all of the touch and button controls work. Tap the top right of the shell to toggle the brightness settings. Tap the top left of the shell to filter through the color modes. Press and hold the top left of the shell to cycle through the different pixel grids. And then press and hold on the top right of the shell to display a battery indicator. For the soldered in button controls, press select A and B to toggle the OSD menu. Press B to move down the menu, and press A to move up the menu. Press select and A to be able to edit a menu item. Press select and A to save your settings. Press select and B to close the OSD menu altogether. The additional feature that the button controls have is being able to adjust the vertical and horizontal axis. But since this kit is laminated, the screen should be pretty much aligned to where it is really not needed to adjust. I will link the kit and different tools that I used in the description.